Thank you. We now call to order the Community Development, General Government and Housing Committee of the City of Winston-Salem. First of all, good afternoon and Happy New Year. Due to the pandemic, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized, raise their hand, and state their vote. Committee members are Councilmember Annette Scipio, Vice Chair, Councilmember Robert Clark, and Councilmember Kevin Monday, and myself, Denise D. Adams, Chair. Would the City Clerk please call the roll, please?
Councilmember Scipio.
Here.
Councilmember Monday.
Present.
Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Here. One other thing, just as we did yesterday, council meeting for the month of January is Tuesday, January 18th, due to the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. We have a consent and general agenda. The consent agenda has 3 items and the general agenda has 5. Are there any items that committee members or council would like to be pulled for discussion at this time?
C2.
Are there any others? With that, may I have a motion?
Move approval of the balance.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Clark and Councilmember Scipio. May we have the roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Monday.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes. With item C2, we have Dr. Marquise Barnett. The City Clerk, please read the item.
Item C2, ordinance amending Chapter 2, Article Section 2-213B and C regarding residency restrictions of the City of Winston-Salem Code of Ordinances.
Thank you. Dr. Barnett.
Good evening. What we have in front of you, this item actually, I believe, came to this committee previously for information, and it comes before you today. The city manager tasked the Human Resources Department with looking at ways that we may be able to attract and retain some of the most qualified candidates. As you all know, we are facing a labor shortage, not just in this area, but in this region and indeed in the United States as a whole. So as we looked at it, we looked at our neighboring jurisdictions, we looked at what folks are doing at some of the other larger municipalities in the state of North Carolina. And what we found in doing that comparison is that we were out of step, I'll say, with what a lot of those other jurisdictions are doing, in that they did not have a residency requirement for their senior staff or for any of their staff. The other part of what this does is it expands and allows for our police officers to live. It allows for our police officers to take their take-home vehicles a little bit further than where the policy currently stands. And so that's just a summary of where the item is, and I'm happy to take any questions that any member of the committee may have.
Thank you. Councilmember Scipio, since you asked this item.
Yes, I think that this is a good thing and it can be a bad thing, but I think the good things outweigh the bad parts. I'm a person who, when I left Winston, I was into commuting. So it wasn't anything foreign to drive one way to go to work. And in bigger cities, that is absolutely basically the way things are, that you've got to go outside of your territory to get employment. I do believe that commuting is more of a normal here than it had been in the past. People didn't commute here in Winston for many, many years, but things have changed. I do understand the need and the desire for our more senior leaders to actually invest in the community by living in the community. But at this point, given how hard it is to attract people and keep them, I'm thinking that having a residency requirement that's so fixed as ours currently is not really making us competitive in the marketplace. So I really think the benefits of getting good people and keeping good people will outweigh the fact that they aren't living in the city.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or concerns? Councilmember McIntyre.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just, something that plays into this is housing costs. And so if the more we can make it affordable for our employees to live closer in, the better off we are. But our home prices in Winston-Salem have been accelerating faster than any other metro area in the state. So we need to provide more opportunity for housing. It all comes around. So let's keep our eye on the ball. Thanks.
Yes, it's all connected. Councilmember Larson.
Can I ask about the 60-mile radius a little bit and how that was determined? I saw one other city, I believe it was it Raleigh, had a 60-mile radius on theirs. And that seemed to be, that takes us all the way down to Charlotte, basically, I believe is what the maps were showing. I'm curious as to whether any thought was given to like a 50-mile radius to keep us out of this Mecklenburg, Charlotte area or what? What was thinking behind 60 miles?
Mr. Barnett or Mr. Garrity, who wants to come in? Mr. Garrity.
I'll do that one. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem. Good evening, members of City Council. When we looked at that and talking to the police department, as you can see on that comparison, we have some of our competitors like Greensboro and Durham. You can live anywhere. We looked at 60 miles basically being an hour, so that if we have a really major emergency and we have to recall police and firefighters because something terrible has happened, they can get back within an hour. So that's how we came up with 60 miles. And of course, you can see Raleigh does have 60 miles. So that's how we got 60.
Time and distance.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more comments? May I have, Councilmember Clark, did you raise your hand? May I have a motion for this ordinance amending chapter 2 of the city ordinances, please, C2.
Motion for the passage of C2 21-0687 ordinance amending chapter 2 of Article 4.
May I have a second?
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Monday and Councilmember Scipio. City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio,
Yes.
Councilmember Monday,
Aye.
Councilmember Clark,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes. And it passes. Now we will move on to our general agenda, which has 5 items. And would the city clerk please call the first item?
Item G1, overview of redlining in Winston-Salem. This item was continued from the December 14th, 2021 Community Development, Housing and General Government Committee meeting.
Let me preface this before the presentation begins. As Councilmember McIntyre and many of you, it is now almost impossible for us to have a meeting, committee or council without the discussion of housing. But some of the things I think is imperative for us to do as leaders is to begin the education process of our citizens, because they all wonder, how did we get to this point? And I think going forward with the virus and everything, whether we're able to do the housing summit in live or virtual, I think that anytime we are presented with an opportunity to educate and engage, I think it's our responsibility to do so. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wanda Allen Abraham.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council, good afternoon. I hope that you all can understand me. I've been drinking some hot tea to try to be a little clearer for you this afternoon, but my apologies for not having the clearest voice for you. And yes, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, we hear a lot about redlining also in our department through the fair housing work that we do by enforcing, housing discrimination laws, and also with our mediation efforts with landlord-tenant allegations and complaints. So we hear about redlining, people wanting to know what is it, and surprisingly enough, there are quite a few people, I think it's more generational than anything, who believe that redlining is something, they either think it's something that was yesterday and is not going on now, or they think it's a relatively new phenomenon, which of course it is neither. And so what I would like to do is just give you all an overview of exactly what redlining is today and what it used to be. Next slide, please. Can you all see the next slide? I can't see it on my end. Okay.
It's not up on the screen now.
Okay. I have the city clerk assist me with this. And so while they are working on getting the PowerPoint presentation back on screen, I am going to just talk with you a little bit about the basics of redlining. And so really what redlining is all about is the fact that, there we go, the basics of redlining is that there were laws and policies that were put in place quite some time ago by banks and other institutions so that there could be a legitimate way to refuse to offer mortgages, or if they did offer mortgages, it was legitimate and legal to offer worse rates to customers, namely customers who happen to be African American. And so these redlining rules and policies only applied to certain neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods, of course, were predominantly African American, 100% African American. And this really does represent the clearest way that legal housing discrimination was developed, implemented, and enforced by our federal government on down. And so, of course, we know now that in 1968, that the redlining laws were abolished, and that's what gave birth to the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws, in which our department is responsible for enforcing. Next slide, please. And so with federally sanctioned redlining, basically what that meant was after the New Deal back in 1934, the FHA was created, the Federal Housing Administration was created to bring the housing market back up to where it needed to be financially and economically. Because of course, after the Great Depression, economics weren't looking that good, things needed to be reinvigorated, and housing was certainly a pivotal part of reinvigorating the United States. And so what they wanted to do was incentivize people to be homeowners, because a lot of people, of course, were disenchanted by what they'd experienced during the Great Depression. And so they were trying to figure out, they being the federal government, trying to figure out ways to get people to buy homes and become homeowners. And so instead of creating policies to make the housing affordability and accessibility more, I guess, broader, I should say broader instead of more, broader to most people, what they ended up doing was creating racially restrictive covenants. And so that in effect meant that redlining was in full effect in over 200 cities. So these racially restrictive covenants, once again, gave federal backing and legal backing to ensuring that African Americans would not be legally allowed to live in neighborhoods if others, particularly white Americans, resided within those neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And so the national practice of redlining beginning in 1934 was really reinforced and girded by the FHA under the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which used residential security maps for mortgage underwriting. They wanted to be able to help the government and banks to clearly understand and know which neighborhoods were outside of their approved lending areas. Next slide, please. And so municipalities really did play a very significant role in working hand in hand with the federal government to ensure that discriminatory housing practices were in full effect. And as a matter of fact, if anyone dared to deviate from what those laws required in terms of racial segregation, they could and would often be arrested and charged with violating that law. So this, we're talking 50 years after the abolition of slavery, local governments continue to legally enforce housing segregation. And so zoning laws and ordinances were written to make sure that African Americans could neither buy or rent houses that were within neighborhoods that were interracial or either predominantly white neighborhoods. So in 1917, the US Supreme Court ruled that zoning laws like that were unconstitutional. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about all of those things that I just mentioned, we're really looking at it from more of a national perspective. We're talking about what the federal laws required, what the federal government's role was, and so forth. But I think the more imminent and pressing question for us is, what was the role of our local government here in Winston-Salem back then? So Winston-Salem was unfortunately one of the first municipalities to legally sanction redlining through local ordinances and zoning laws and policies. So we do hold that dubious distinction. And urban renewing plans and designs were used to justify redlining. So more specifically, when we're talking about urban renewal plans that derive from the construction of US 52, I-40, the expansion of RJ Reynolds Tobacco, and so forth, that type of urban renewal really did displace a large number of African-American families. And we'll touch on that in just a moment. But the city officially upheld the practice of redlining until the federal government made it illegal once again with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Next slide, please. So how did redlining actually impact Winston-Salem? So beginning around 1960, again, like I mentioned, urban renewal and planning were used to actually serve as pretexts for developing policies and laws that displaced more than 4,000 predominantly African-American families here in Winston-Salem. And of course, it was for the ultimate goal of building Interstate 40, US 52, and some of the other expansions that I mentioned a moment ago. But the end result was it was the destabilization of historic African-American neighborhoods that were previously thriving neighborhoods. They were self-sufficient neighborhoods. And again, they had been around for a very long period of time. So they were very well established. And most of the residents in those neighborhoods owned their homes. So during the Jim Crow era, cities like Winston-Salem and Asheville enforced racially segregated housing. And the legacy of these practices we're still feeling today, because oftentimes in those redlined areas, we are seeing present day poverty, we're seeing a lack of access to jobs and transportation, and so on. And so the downtown and East Winston areas were primarily the most negatively impacted areas here locally. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to do was actually talk about the mapping. What did that actually look like? And from 1938 to 1952, we have examples of local maps that clearly showed and delineated exactly where those red lines were. And so it gives us a very clear idea of where the mortgages were not being lent, what residents were being denied and deprived of home ownership. And so those red line areas, once again, are pretty much in East Winston and the downtown areas, which is where the African-American neighborhoods were established. Even the current 2020 census maps still show formerly redlined neighborhoods as being high poverty areas in those same communities. And so again, like I said, we see food deserts and we see other forms of economic repercussions that have resulted as a result of a lack of access to basic services and the denial of housing ownership. Next slide, please. And so when we're talking about the color-coded maps, just for your informational purposes, oftentimes what would happen is you would see all of these different colors, and I'm going to show you an example of that in this presentation. But green always meant if an area was outlined in green or highlighted in green, that meant that that was a really in-demand area. It was where professionals lived, and those areas were actually considered something that would keep Black people out. They were explicitly homogenous, and so meaning they did not have anyone in the neighborhood who was not white. Now, the blue areas were considered still desirable areas, but they had already reached their peak. And so they felt like, you know, they were stable, but they weren't exactly green, which was the highest rating, because they did have some risk, even though it was a low risk, they had some risk of what was called infiltration, meaning that non-white groups could potentially move into those neighborhoods. The yellow demarcations meant that neighborhoods were definitely declining. So all it took to be highlighted as yellow would be that the neighborhood had to border Black neighborhoods. And so they were considered risky because of a threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower grade populations. And so that, of course, is a quote. And then the red would be considered, in the redlining areas would be considered hazardous because these neighborhoods were already, quote, infiltrated, meaning that they already had all or majority African Americans residing within those neighborhoods. So they were considered undesirable neighborhoods because the population that resided within those neighborhoods was considered to be undesirable. Therefore, they were ineligible for fair, excuse me, I'm so used to saying fair housing. They were ineligible for FHA backing. Next slide, please. And so this is an example of what those maps look like. And you can see, again, the red areas pretty much are Winston-Salem's downtown areas in East Winston. You see the yellow areas, which again are like the borderline areas because they border traditional African-American neighborhoods. And then of course you see the blue and the green. So this is from an actual map from 1937, courtesy of the Center for Design Innovation. Next slide, please. And so when you compare that and you look at the low income displacement and concentration from the 2000 to 2016 US Census tracts, again, you will see that a lot of those areas pretty much match well with what you just saw in the previous map. Some of the same areas are, they're previously redlined areas or borderline areas, the yellow areas. Next slide, please. And again, with this area that we're seeing now, this is showing Winston-Salem's food deserts. Once again, is focused pretty much and concentrated on downtown Winston-Salem and East Winston, which is consistent with the redlined areas from so many years ago. So we are indeed still seeing a lot of the repercussions today. Next slide, please. And so when we're talking about what the federal government did to address the restrictive covenants and the results of redlining, basically the Fair Housing Act was passed. And it was something that was enforced in a lot of areas, but not all areas. And even with the passage and enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, still we had restrictive covenants that were being legally enforced, or the language was still present in the deeds. And so what that meant was you had these racially restricted deeds so that people were unable still to completely get rid of that language and those practices because they were written into the deeds. And even today, You can pull old deeds right now, very old deeds, and you will still see that racially restrictive language. Next slide, please. And so again, that's why the Fair Housing Act is so important. And what I really wanted to do here was just really emphasize the fact that there is a definite strong tie-in between fair housing laws of today that we currently enforce to what we're talking about with redlining and the restrictive covenants and so on and so forth, the racial zoning laws. All of those things connect. Those are dots that definitely connect. And we would be remiss if we did not understand that fair housing discrimination is still a factor in our modern day society, especially even here locally, but especially in the South. But we also have to understand that redlining is not dead and gone, because the repercussions, the reverberations of redlining are something that we are still seeing today, but in a different form. We're seeing it in the form of race discrimination, color discrimination, and so on and so forth, as prescribed under the actual fair housing laws that we enforce in the Human Relations DEI department. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that is really educating the community about all of this, the tie-in with fair housing and the history of redlining and so forth, is the Undesigned the Redline exhibit. And our department is happy to be a partner with this exhibit with the Winston-Salem Foundation, and also our African-American Heritage Initiative, which is an advisory board. They are also a partner of this initiative. And I'm happy to be joined today by Mr. Charlie Gardner from the Winston-Salem Foundation, and also by Ms. Dr. Cynthia Villa-Gomez from Winston-Salem State University, who chairs the African-American Heritage Initiative. And I would just like to ask them if they would like to add anything to what I've already said. And I do see that my last bullet, when I sent that in, the exhibit was ending in January, but now I know it's been extended through February, right, Charlie?
Yeah, that was my one point. Thank you so much, Mona, for the introduction. And the exhibit, if you have been able to see it, you know is, well, it's been great. And we've had a lot of different folks move through there. I think as I went in there about a month ago, and we had already about 500 people go through, sign the guest book in Forsyth County. And so it's just been a lot of people from the community going over and seeing it. We are extending it through end of February, so we can go through Black History Month. The one, unfortunately, we had been offering public tours. We have suspended those due to the Omicron for January, but are planning to keep them for February, but we're going to be reevaluating. And if you go to the Winston-Salem Foundation's website, you can find out details about all the community partners. We have about 24 community partners who are collaborating on this exhibit.
Thank you. Ms. Villa-Gomez.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for inviting us to join you today. And I want to thank you for your courage and your boldness last spring when you passed the reparative resolution 21-0139. You really set a precedent for here in the South, and you charged African-American Heritage Initiative Committee to write the narrative that really includes the present absent neighborhoods that were destroyed by quote unquote urban renewal and gentrification, which redlining negatively dovetailed with and opened the door for. And so our committee is very honored that you have charged us with this important task. And we're looking forward this spring to be working on a new virtual history project that will help us accomplish what you've charged us to do. Winston-Salem State University students will be involved in writing the sort of storyboards, if you will, for this project. And so we're very excited and honored to be a part of this. And the Redlining exhibition, we're really grateful to the Winston-Salem Foundation, particularly to Mr. Charlie Gardner for supporting us and involving us. And I really think it's created a great platform for our initiative committee to move forward. So I will say, even today in my department meeting, there were discussions about particular African-American neighborhoods. And I made the point that all of you are very concerned, and the city is concerned with this reparative justice and undoing the harm and really supporting our citizens. And so I'm just so grateful to be here with you today. And I encourage you to see the exhibit. And we're really looking forward to seeing where the redlining project will go. It's national. This exhibition is national, and we will have a virtual presence here in our city for the exhibit from here on out, which again I think is a great role model for other cities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner and Ms. Vila Gomez. Thank you, Dr. Alan Abraha. Is there any last comments you'd like to make? And then I'll move to ask if council or committee or council have any comments. Does committee have any comments? Again, thank you, Winston-Salem Foundation, Winston-Salem State University, the African-American Initiative, and all of us that are collaboratively working together to make our city a very intentional, diverse, and inclusive city in every system that is present that we live with every day, whether it's housing, education, childcare, work, or anything. Are there any comments? Councilmember Burke. And then Councilmember Mundy.
Yes, I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Abraham and Mrs. Villa Gomez and Mr. Gardner from WSSU. This has been a very, very, very informative presentation. And I think it is very important for the council members as well as community members to hear this, see this, and become more aware of it as we move forward to plan housing and addressing the housing deficit in our community. I hope and pray that with this knowledge, with this information, we will not make the same mistakes from the past. And I just thank you for this presentation.
Councilmember Mundy.
I want to echo that thanks and appreciation for explaining this in such a concise and easy to understand way. This truly is a shameful piece of history. And I'm afraid that, I never learned it in school. I wonder why that is, but it needs to be taught. It needs to be brought to light. It helps all of us understand, regardless of the color of your skin, why so much damage was done in the past. I wasn't here, I didn't see it, but now I understand better. And thank you for helping me understand.
Thank you. Any others? Thank you all again so much. As I said, the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee, as we move forward, will continue to educate not just the committee, not just the council, not just staff, but the city and everybody at large. Whether we do a 10-minute presentation or 15, I think it's imperative that we seize every opportunity. Mr. Gardner, Winston-Salem Foundation, final comment, please.
Yeah, I just want to share that if anyone would like a tour of the exhibit, I'm happy to find a time to schedule with you all in February, perhaps. Maybe we can plan on something. So if anyone's interested, Wanda has my contact information, and I'm happy to help facilitate that all. Thank you.
Thank you. One more note, the National League of Cities has had this traveling exhibit in its midst, off and on, over the past 4 or 5 years. I've seen it. The next time I saw it was when Ms. Newman, Mr. King, and I can't remember who else went with us. When we went to Atlanta for the Grounded Solutions Conference, which attracts thousands of housing educators, advocates, and policymakers. It was there, and it was the whole exhibit. So again, I just appreciated being in Winston-Salem. Councilmember Scipio had voiced that she wanted to bring it here to Winston, and we appreciate your activism for making that possible. Again, thanks to all. City Clerk, may we move to the next item?
G2, resolution revising the City of Winston-Salem COVID-19 vaccination policy.
Mr. Rao, you're up.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council. I do have a brief presentation to present proposed revisions to the City of Winston-Salem's COVID-19 vaccination policy. Back in October of 2018, October 18th of last year, in response to the increasing numbers arising from the Delta variant, the council adopted a COVID-19 vaccination policy that went into effect in October of 25th. That policy essentially has ended at the end of December, and so we're bringing forward some revisions today. To just recap, why did we present this policy back in October? The increased costs that the city has experienced as a result of COVID-19 infections and lost work time, the loss of accrued personal time, the impact on operations, and the impact on employee physical and mental health. And so the overriding priority of this policy is to increase safety in the workplace. Next slide, please. So just the highlights very briefly in the original policy, a key component of that was providing a one-time lump sum incentive payment for employees who demonstrated that they were fully vaccinated. And that incentive was paid out with the December 17th payroll. It was $1,000 for full-time employees and $500 for part-time employees. In addition, for unvaccinated employees, there was a 4-week mandatory weekly testing period where employees had to provide proof of testing only, but they had to provide that proof in order to be able to report to work the following week. As part of that particular component of the policy, there was progressive discipline for non-compliance. We do require full vaccination for newly hired employees, and there would be disciplinary action, including termination for submitting false records. So I am pleased to report that I think the incentive had an impact because we had less than probably 50% of our workforce fully vaccinated prior to this policy. And based on what was paid out on December 17th, we had 1,920 employees who received the incentive. And that was approximately 85% of our workforce. There's still at the time 383 employees who remained unvaccinated who have been required to submit to the weekly COVID-19 testing. So this chart just shows the breakdown in the cost of the incentive. $1.8 million was paid out. About $400,000 of that was eligible through ARPA because those were newly vaccinated, fully vaccinated individuals since the implementation of the policy, and then 1.4 million of the incentive would be paid out of our health benefits fund. Next slide. So at the end of December, we had 4 weeks of mandatory testing. So yes, the city management did provide an update to this committee back in December. So we were bringing forward revisions, brought this forward originally Last week, we delayed that to get some more information about where things stood in the community in terms of testing capacity. But here's basically the highlights of the proposed revisions. We are wanting to provide both positive and negative measures to incentivize employees to still seek to become fully vaccinated. So in terms of a positive incentive, this policy would establish a new financial incentive of $200 for full-time employees and $100 for part-time employees who receive the booster. The policy then would extend the availability of the partial vaccination financial incentive that was in place, after December 6th. That was the cutoff date for employees to be eligible for the full $1,000 incentive for full-time employees. But this policy proposes to continue the partial vaccination of $500 for full-time employees and $250 for part-time employees. Policy also authorizes department heads to provide exempt employees who are not eligible for overtime pay, who are unvaccinated, eligible to basically compensate them with comp time to get tested. So in other words, employees can go get their testing on city time. The city would pay for that. And if they're exempt, they would get comp time to do so. One change that I would say is tightens, if you will. The testing requirement is now that under this revision, unvaccinated employees would have to provide proof of a negative test result each week by the deadline. So whereas before it was just proof of testing, they now would have to provide a proof of a negative test by the deadline to report to work the following week. And those tests must note the testing facility that the test was taken, the name of the employee, the date, and clearly note the negative test result. If the result is not available by the weekly deadline, and we know that the turnaround time can be 2 or 3 days, then employees must still provide a proof of testing by that deadline to be able to report to work. And then by that following Monday, they still would need to provide the negative test result. So a little bit stringent reporting requirement with this revision. Next slide. To continue the additional revisions, the policies again reinforces the policies that are already in place regarding employees who test positive for COVID-19. They have to follow our existing protocols. We're basically saying you don't report to work. Obviously, if you test positive, but certainly even if you don't feel well, we're encouraging employees not to report to work. Under this particular provision, if an employee were to test positive for COVID-19, then they would be removed from the mandatory testing during their quarantine period. And so they would not be penalized for not providing the weekly testing protocols, because we recognize the fact that they could test positive for a period of time, even beyond their quarantine. But at least during their quarantine period, they would be removed from the mandatory testing. The revisions also include additional disciplinary measures for noncompliance. So the original policy established progressive discipline for a 4-week period because of a 4-week mandatory testing period. What we're suggesting through these revisions is that this policy would continue, and that there would be 2 additional progressive disciplinary measures. For a 5th incident of noncompliance, it would be a 10-day suspension without pay. And then for a 6th missed or refusal noncompliance, it would be indefinite suspension without pay. And part of this policy makes clear that this isn't a reset, that if someone had 3 incidents, let's say, of noncompliance, then the next incident of noncompliance would be the 4th level of disciplinary action. So there would not be a reset to the disciplinary progression. Next slide. And then finally, just some more administrative details to the policy. It notes that the Human Resources Department will maintain records with the status of all employees that submit their records of vaccination and testing. It does state that the city manager will continue to provide the mayor and council periodic reports on our progress. And we also will seek additional guidance because we know obviously this policy was put in place because of Delta, and now we've got the Omicron. And so we will be coming to you all to seek additional guidance as needed. And then there's some other administrative edits, if you will, to the policy to distinguish it from the original policy. If the council approves these revisions next month, if it comes out of committee today for recommendation, and if it is considered and approved next Tuesday, the 18th, we will require employees to submit proof of a negative test result by that Friday, by January 21st. So we can continue to administer the policy. If the committee recommends approval today, then we will go ahead and communicate to unvaccinated employees that they need to be ready potentially to schedule their tests so they can comply if the policy revisions are approved next week. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? Councilmember Clark?
Yeah, two questions. Has there been a void period where the old policy expired and we have yet to adopt a new one? And if so, how are we treating things in that period, which would be, I guess, right now? And secondly, how has it worked as far as people being able to get tests and get them turned in at a appropriate time?
Councilmember Clark, the last required week of testing was the last week in December. In order for employees to report to work last week, employees who were unvaccinated did not have to submit tests last week because the policy did end, and they've not had to test this week to be able to report to work next week. So there's about a 2-week hiatus, if you will, in the testing. We know that the availability of tests is a challenge. We've heard from the hospitals that there is a challenge in terms of testing capacity, but we also know that, for example, Novant Health has extended the days of operation for their Haynes Mall location. We know that Union Baptist Church has been a host of a state testing site. So we know that there are testing sites available, but we recognize the fact that it is a challenge to schedule the rapid tests and even the regular tests.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Scipio, Councilmember Mundy, Councilmember Scipio, Councilmember Larson.
Thank you. I just want to follow up in with a question about, I think it was on the old policy. I didn't see it on this policy that new employees would be required to be vaccinated before they could begin work. Is that still the case?
Yes, sir. That's still the case. That was not revised out of the policy. That would continue.
Okay. And the other thing is, I think it's more of a comment I want to make, but maybe you can confirm this. I know that we have our detractors and those who don't really agree with the testing, but it's my understanding that our testing has in fact found that some people were infected with the virus, and we potentially saved lives, or at least people from getting sick, their coworkers and they themselves. And can you confirm that we did find that to be the case?
That's correct, Councilman Mundy. There were some positive results. I don't know the exact number offhand, but yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good thing that we continue the testing.
Councilmember Scipio.
I think Mr. Barnett had a comment on that testing results.
Mr. Barnett.
You're muted.
My apologies. To Ben's question from the question that Ben had a moment ago, or Mr. Rao had a moment ago, we have had 37 confirmed cases of employees who were who were not symptomatic and who were essentially tested positive when they went for their mandatory testing, and we were able to keep them from coming into the workplace and potentially infecting other employees.
Thank you. Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, Mr. Rao, Mr. Barnett, do we ever consider having a on-site testing at our health department at the Johnson building?
Dr. Barnett, I'll let you respond to that.
Sure. So that is something that we considered, and we consulted very closely with the city attorney's office. And basically, it was decided from a testing standpoint for us to maybe stay away from providing those as an employer. But that is something with the nurse practitioner clinic that we offer. That is something that we will offer. We offer testing to symptomatic employees only over at the employee medical facility.
Councilmember Larson.
Yeah, to follow up on the testing, I'm actually a strong proponent to actual vaccination, and anything we can do to continue to encourage vaccination, I think is paramount. Testing is a little problematic because it takes the workforce off the site. And I would encourage us to think about trying to bring that testing onto site so our employees do not have to travel, lose time and effective, loss of productivity. If there's a way to do that, let's take a look at that. Maybe I am concerned that we lose a lot of time. We are offering the ability for them to go off on company time to get this testing done, as I understand. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
So if they have to travel to the Sears building or Novant or someplace to get this testing done, the time it takes to travel there to get the test done and to return must be fairly significant. And it would be nice if we could expedite that in some way so that it's readily available at one point in time. Everybody goes and gets tested and everybody ends up getting their results back, and we know exactly who's been tested when. But maybe that's not legally possible, but it would be nice if we could arrange that.
Thank you. I see the city attorney, Carmen.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. I'll be happy to respond to that request. We did, in fact, look at that particular request some time ago. And under the EEOC guidance, there is an issue when an employer provides an incentive and also provides the testing site. There's a question of whether or not employees are being coerced to go to that site in essence to get the incentive. But we'll be happy to look at that again.
Thank you. Councilmember Burke.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I just have a question, Mr. Rao. I'm looking at slide 6, and I'm looking at the first bullet where when our employees are out, when they have received a positive COVID test or diagnosed with COVID, and they are removed from the mandatory testing process, once they return back to work, at what point are they put back on this mandatory testing, weekly testing protocol?
Yes, ma'am. So they would start back when they return to work. The Human Resources Department would be communicating with those employees to let them know when they are cleared to return to work. And I think at that point, then they would be informed as to what their next step would be in terms of resuming the weekly testing.
Thank you.
Are there any other concerns? This is a action item. So are we ready to present a motion from anyone?
I'll move approval.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you, Councilmember Scipio. It's been moved and properly seconded. Would the city clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes. And the motion passes. Thank you. City clerk, would you please call the next item?
Item G4, Winston-Salem Affordable Housing, item G3, resolution amending Article 2 of the City of Winston-Salem Personnel Resolution to add and delete certain position classifications and adjust the pay grades for select positions.
Thank you. Mr. Rao.
Good afternoon again, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council. We'll ask the Deputy City Clerk to pull up a table that's included with this particular item. So Dr. Barnett had presented earlier the new residency requirement, and that is one measure and a number of measures that we're going to be looking at over the coming weeks to improve our competitiveness as an organization to attract and retain employees. This particular item is looking at a number of our positions, particularly our hard to fill positions. Just to give you a little bit of background, we have 72 vacancies. This is probably as recent as a week or so ago in various equipment operator and frontline supervisor positions. And that's about a 27% vacancy rate in those areas. And it's impacting a number of our public works areas: utilities, field operations, sanitation, traffic field operations, and vegetation management. In addition, we have hard to fill positions in other areas as well, including community development, where we've got 11 vacancies in housing code enforcement and housing rehab programs, municipal engineering, where we've got 8 vacancies in various civil engineering and technical positions, and in public safety communications, where we have 20 vacancies in the communications operator positions. So our staffing challenges, cut across the organization. And so the purpose of this item is, one, to propose increasing the grade for a number of these hard to fill positions. And the table that you see in front of you notes those positions that where we have proposed increasing their salary ranges by 1 grade. And our hope in doing this will be that we can fill those positions more quickly, restore our service levels, particularly the impacts we've seen with those equipment operator positions and frontline supervisors, but also improve our housing code enforcement, increase our housing rehabilitation activity, minimize our wait times, and accelerate our progress on our capital projects. Now, in addition to these proposed changes, which are really kind of prospective, that we were willing to put these regrades in place so that as we start to aggressively advertise and market these positions, we can hopefully attract more applicants to these opportunities. We're also wanting to formalize some changes that have been made over the last couple of months due to some reorganizations to align position classifications with their current job responsibilities. And so we note that in the table there on the right-hand side. So it's kind of really twofold what we're doing with this amendment to the personnel resolution, formalizing some previously adopted changes based on reorganizations and alignment of duties, and then also looking at a number of positions where we're having challenges filling those positions, and we're proposing to regrade them, increase their grade by 1 level. And you can see there some of the other positions in the public works area. So it's not just equipment operators and frontline supervisors. You can see there are positions in transportation, trades positions. So just it really cuts across the organization. How would we pay for this, at least for the remaining 5 months of this fiscal year? We would propose that these changes would go into effect with the first pay period in February. And because we've had so many vacancies, we do project that we have sufficient salary savings to cover the cost of the increased cost of these regrades for the remaining 5 months of the fiscal year, even though we have been incurring some overtime against some of the salary savings to be able to maintain our staffing or our coverage in a number of areas. We still feel like that we have the savings in place to cover these increased costs for the remaining 5 months of the fiscal year. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. Let me preface, if there are any comments, We are all in a very competitive battle across North Carolina, particularly in the Triad, all over the country. I did direct, the city manager and I have had many conversations since last year. Dr. Barnett, Ms. Tony, and everybody, I told them this is the new world of work. And we can't wait any longer to look at how we improve our edge with the other cities to try to hold on even to what we have, whether it's public safety or whether it's sanitation, whether it's utilities, whether it's staff working in the buildings. We have now got to go, I told them, think of it as the playoffs in the Super Bowl. We got to go and recruit like an NFL or NBA team. We got to offer the best deal, the best whatever incentives that we can afford. I got that. But if we do nothing, all of us will be at the yard on the sanitation trucks because there won't be anybody there. Councilmember Clark, then Councilmember Larson, and then I'll go back to Mr. Rao, and then Councilmember McIntyre.
Thank you. Just real quick, I know there's certain restrictions on hiring retirees on a part-time basis, but I think it's worth looking at. And if we have to go to Raleigh in the short session to get them to change something, but I think we got to be creative, as Ms. Adams said, and I think one potential area may be to offer creative part-time work. The number of positions that are open is just astronomical.
Staggering.
And I think we're down 90 in police, something like that. I think I'm close with that number. That's just a lot of darn folks. So I think we need to be creative wherever we can. Thank you.
Councilmember McIntyre had his hand up before you, Councilmember Larson. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's okay. And I talked to my colleagues on the North Carolina League of Municipalities as Mayor Pro Tem does at the National League of Cities. And this is not just us. This is common to every municipality across the country. It's unfortunate the way our revaluation cycle occurs. We're seeing tremendous increase in property values, but we won't see an increase in property taxes for another, 4 years? So the cycle timing is not good for us there. But we may have money in the budget that'll get us through this year, but next year we're going to see a pinch on this. But it's something we have to do.
Councilmember Larson.
I'd like to applaud the staff for an aggressive approach to try to solve a problem. I do have one little question. The resolution that we're voting on, that's being voted on tonight by committee, gives a more comprehensive list of all positions. And that list lists, of course, the pay grades, but I noticed a number of those positions have been lined through. Does that mean we're eliminating positions?
Mr. Rao?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, so Councilmember Larson, I think there were a couple of instances on that table where we're doing a reclassification at least I know of one area in the city clerk's office where the reclassification brings that position title in line with the duties of those positions, and so there's no longer a need to have what's called a senior administrative clerk position or an administrative clerk position. So the strike through would eliminate that position title from the general pay plan. So it's a kind of a technical adjustment in that sense, because we've determined that those positions should be classified differently.
Yeah, a number of positions obviously have been renamed. But example, Director, Office of Business Inclusion and Advancement is struck through as a job, and I'm wondering if that task has been reallocated to other positions, or is it renamed? It is not renamed. I'm just curious. And the bottom question is the city staff diminished in this process by any number of people? Do we have any less body counts? I mean, I know we got less bodies, we got vacant positions, but are there less actual slots available for employment as a result of this reorganization?
No, sir. And in this particular case, the director of the Office of Business Inclusion Advancement was given a new title, Economic Development Director, which is more in line with the additional duties that that position now assumes. So it's not just directing that particular office, but it's also involved in some of our other economic development programs, like our economic development incentive projects. And so this was a case where it's just more of a technical change from the standpoint that that position title is no longer really relevant. It's now an economic development director, which appears further down that list. So, but we're not eliminating that position. So that these changes are changes in position titles, changes in pay grades, but it is not eliminating any of the authorized positions that council has approved over the years.
And a lot of these, Councilmember Larson, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Rao, Dr. Barnett, and Mr. Garrity, it's just like any business or corporation. It's called reorganization and alignment to your customers and the services and products that you can provide. There are people in our organization that have been given added duties that have shifted from two people versus to one people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're working harder. We're working smarter because those positions that got lines and others, there are some that we are going to eliminate. But we also, as you said and stated earlier, we have a lot of positions that are open. So right now, the game is we've got to get people, qualified people that are passionate about working for the city of Winston-Salem to come and work for us. So at this point right now,
Mayor Pro Tem Adams, I just want to add one other. I want to note one other change that I failed to mention in my opening remarks. The focus of this is to help us become more competitive and attract more applicants to these positions. But at the same time, we also amended the personnel resolution when it comes to regrades, that for employees who are already in a position where there is a regrade that's been approved, that they will be moved up either to the minimum of the new grade, or if they're already above that minimum, they'll get a 5% increase. So it's kind of the greater of moving it up to the minimum or receiving a 5%. If they're already above the minimum, they'll still get a 5% increase. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that, because that's also what we feel like is very important to retain the employees that we have.
And it also goes back to what we talked about a few years ago when we were trying to get to the $15 an hour, the compression factor. You can't raise people's money or even change the labor grade without changing the money. So basically all of this is lining up. And as Councilmember McIntyre said, we'll figure it out in the spring. Could I get a motion, please, to move this to council?
I'll move approval of the motion.
May I have a second?
Second, Mundy.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Clark and Councilmember Mundy. City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio,
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy,
Aye.
Councilmember Clark,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes, thank you all so much. And as we move forward, you're going to see a lot of these things come into, as well as housing, because again, it's the new world of work and staff has been directed to, we have to be very competitive. Also, item G5 has been pulled, so we will not be doing that. So City Clerk, would you please call the next item, please?
Item G4, Winston-Salem Affordable Housing Coalition 2021 Annual Report.
Miss Tony and Miss Newman.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and members of the committee and council. This evening, the Housing Coalition will review their annual report, and Ms. Marlon Newman, the Director of Community Development, will introduce the chair of that committee and some highlights of the report.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee and members of the council. Marla Newman, Community Development Director. Before you today is the 2021 annual report from the Affordable Housing Coalition. As you recall, the coalition was established approximately 3 years ago by the council, and the responsibilities of the coalition include, as you see here, expand affordable housing opportunities, engage supporters and advocates for affordable housing, coordinate and secure sustainable resources, and advise the council on the use of city funds to support housing development. Of course, throughout various portions of today's committee meeting, we've talked about the need and the importance of affordable housing. And so this committee has been charged with kind of leading the effort to help us along that path. As Assistant City Manager Tony stated, joining us for this meeting this evening is Mr. Derwin Montgomery, who is the chair of the Affordable Housing Coalition. And I'd like to introduce him to kind of walk through some, not only the highlights, but really just kind of give you some feedback on some of what the coalition deliberated on during 2021, and even some of the vision for moving forward, part of which is included in this annual report that kind of outlined what they had decided by the time the year ended. So if I could introduce Mr. Montgomery and yield the floor to him, I'd like to do that at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. Thank you, Ms. Tony. Mr. Montgomery.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams, and the rest of the council. I'm trying to get the things not totally coming up for me here on this side. It says disabled, but I'll go ahead. Mayor Pro Tem Adams and the rest of the members of the council, thank you for the opportunity to be present and to share some of the work that the Affordable Housing Coalition has been doing over the last year. And up here we go. There it is. As Ms. Newman already stated, and before I get into the crux of some of the highlights that I like to pull out for you, I want to say one, the staff has been absolutely amazing. Marla Newman and her staff has been absolutely great in helping facilitate the conversations, and not only the conversations, but the actions of the Affordable Housing Coalition, who is a diverse group of individuals from a cross-section of the community, including community members, individuals who work in the affordable housing space, as well as those who are in the actual facilitation and creation of affordable housing directly. Where I'd like to bring your attention to are some of the key points, 9 specific points that the Affordable Housing Coalition over this year, through the help and assistance of facilitation that was helped and brought to us by a consultant from New Orleans that helped to frame some of our conversation, that helped us develop on our core centers of what we see as needs for us to move forward. Those 9 core areas in the report there come down as a part of its deliberations. The coalition determined that overarching multi-year plan is needed to address Winston-Salem's affordable housing shortage. The goals and desired outcomes of the plan are identified by the coalition R2. And I want to read these 9 specifically, not that you all are not able to read, but I think they're important for us to highlight in this conversation. 1, develop a comprehensive housing plan that centers the community's needs and engages them in a long-term process to provide opportunities for the people of Winston-Salem. 2, preserve existing supply and expand the total supply of affordable rental and home ownership opportunities based on data. Prevent future displacement through development activities and continued study and policy review. 4, develop routine and emergency housing navigation services for all citizens of Winston-Salem. 5, improve the quality of life and preserve neighborhood character while enforcing and promoting fair and equitable housing policies. 6, encourage innovation and sustainable design in housing, transportation, and infrastructure. 7, increase accessibility for all, including residents with special needs, homeless, people who are differently abled, voucher holders, refugees, etc. Examine existing policies with a racial equity lens and the impact those policies have on goals 1 through 7. And 9, develop an ongoing communication and outreach process, which may also include creation of a vision, value statement, or new strategic goal. I wanted to read those specific 9 targeted actions from the coalition because as these conversations have evolved over the course of the last couple of years, and in particular the core work that's taken place over this year, the coalition, if I may summarize a bit of our work, has separated the action that we're taking into two main buckets. 1, the immediate action of advising the council as projects come forward or policies move forward, as we did in writing and speaking our support for the changes in ADUs, but then also that long-term work that's required, which much of what we spoke of in those 9 areas areas hit on. And what the coalition has come to a great sense of is that this work is not something that can be done by the city of Winston-Salem alone. I want to say that again, that the coalition's clear understanding is that this work is not an action that can be unilaterally done by the city of Winston-Salem and will require potentially some outside organization being able to help facilitate the core work of moving the city forward. But the city has a great opportunity of playing the leading role in helping to facilitate the action that needs to take place as we move forward with taking action around affordable housing in our community. Last statements here in reference to the strategic development and implementation strategy here that are important for us to focus our attention on is as an implementation strategy is needed, which will result in an affordable housing plan that one is responsive, proactive, and designed for the long term. Encourages stronger and more creative partnerships between housing organizations, the city, state, lenders, and philanthropy to improve leveraging or resources or in a public capital restructured environment. And 3, uses equity as a growth strategy by leveraging community assets. 4, identifies areas of the city to focus strategic redevelopment. And 5, increases specialization and collaboration among housing organizations to reduce over-competitiveness in certain markets and housing program sectors, thereby creating a stronger, more productive community development interest in industry. And 6, increasing community engagement and awareness about housing-related issues, reducing the gap between people and programs. And as you see here, this is tailored out into 5 phases of the work and the action that will take place and needs to take place in order to actually achieve the goals that are set forward and actually execute the strategy that is above. And then phase 1 is just a simple review existing financing and policy strategies, including nationwide best practices as well as policies that make sense on the ground in Winston-Salem. 2, conduct interviews with stakeholders and focus groups with community members from across the city to review and revise the guiding principles in a housing plan for Winston-Salem. Phase 3, host a neighborhood summit. Phase 4, produce a housing plan document based on research outcomes from phase 1, 2, and 3, and which will include strategies for implementation, timelines, phasing, suggestions. And phase 5, conduct launch event with invitees from across the city from every sector needed for implementation, public, private, nonprofit, community development. This includes policy recommendations for the 2022 or 2023 legislative session. Now, I'll say there is that one of the large reasons of the need for such a plan to be in place is because that creates a framework for the council as well as a framework for staff in terms of what is the action to actually achieve the goals set forth not only by the committee, the coalition, but by the council and the staff as a whole. Today, for the city, although the city has resources that are spent on housing, the framework for that outside of the federal guidelines on how some of those resources are spent are not very clear. Some of the feedback heard from some development and community is not really knowing how to access funds, how development should or shouldn't happen. And one of the things that often happens in sometimes in this is that there are the political implications that are often engaged. But if you have a plan and if you have specific goals associated within that plan, it gives a very, very clear outline of what actions are being taken and what are the standards necessary to invest resources and funds as we move forward. And lastly, as I'll share that the committee and the committee members of the coalition have been very committed in working to ensure that action is the end result. We have heard and we continue to hear the need and the demand for action to take place in and around affordable housing. And like so many other things, COVID threw us off in terms of our original timeline of getting action, getting the plan forward and real full framework to the council as a whole. And so our hope is as we move through 2022, that we'll be able to provide such a plan by working collectively with staff, with the community as a whole, so that we can move forward and really be a hallmark example for the state and others on some innovative opportunities for creating affordable housing in our community as a whole.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. Are there any comments or questions from the committee and or council members? Councilmember McIntyre.
Yeah, I tend to snoop in on a lot of your meetings, Mr. Montgomery, I don't participate in the conversation, but the group that's been working on this has just really done an excellent job, I think, of examining sort of all levels of it. And I do really appreciate sort of the need or the understanding that we need to move fast. We don't necessarily need to break things, but there is some urgency here of getting units out. So all that work is going to come to play here, and as we find opportunities to build some things and get some people in some good housing. So thank you all for your efforts.
Again, part of our responsibility, this committee, is to educate council and staff as to how we are going to arrive at whatever result or place we're going to be to do this. As Mr. Montgomery said, we can't do it. We can do a little bit. We can come up with some of the resources, maybe a little bit, leverage that with some other things, but we are not the subject experts, and we definitely don't have all the staff to go out and create all this information. That's why the council and the mayor, that we have all these commissions and boards, they are the workhorses for the council to help us get from point A to point B. Again, I think Ms. Newman, Community Development Department, Housing, we can't thank you guys enough, because you're over there operating with a shoestring with nobody there but 2 or 3 of you. But we appreciate all the hard work you're putting in to help us get there. Again, this report, like so many boards and commissions, it is part of our city ordinances and policies that these boards and commissions are bound to give us a yearly report. Are there any other comments or questions from the committee or council or staff? You all kind of see where this is going, don't you? We got to start getting up our A game, just like we're doing with the employee situation. And that is to get ready, because we just can't blow the whistle and we all go. We got to at least be knowledgeable. We got to have a sense of urgency, but we also have to be educated. Okay? If that is it, everybody cleared minds? Okay. Then this meeting is adjourned.
Public Works will start at 5 minutes after 6.
Thank you. Thank you all.